and welcome everyone. It is the second episode of Bahçes in this season, and I would like to say a few words about Bahçes to introduce it to you. Bahçes Histories of Cyprus is an independent public history project. Each month we showcase work that brings a fresh and exciting perspective on the past and bring you the audience and listeners in direct contact with the people who research and tell the histories of Cyprus. We welcome people of all different genders, identities, ethnicities, and age and faiths. And if you would like to join our team or support our work, you can find us on Facebook or Instagram, or send us an email at bahceshistorycy@gmail.com. And in this episode, Bahçes editor Dr. Loizos Kapsalis talked to Professor Panikos Panayi. Now I'm going to pass on to our editor Loizos, and thank you and enjoy.
Thank you. Dear friends, welcome to this episode of the Bαhçes Histories of Cyprus. My name is Loizos Kapsalis, and I'm one of the founding editors of the Bαhçes. This evening, I am joined by Panikos Panayi, a professor of European history at the Montfort University in Leicester. Panayi has published widely on migration, food, and interethnic relations in the British Empire. He is the author of Migrant City, A New History of London, and The Germans in India, Elite European Migrants in the British Empire. In his work, Panayi combines a global perspective with a careful concern for the everyday. I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Panayi at the Municipal Gardens here in Nicosia, where he just completed his research for his new book project, The Cypriot Peasant at Home and Abroad. Tonight, I want to talk to Professor Panayi about Cypriot migration in the British Empire, about writing history from below, and about his own journey back home to writing a social history of the rural population of Cyprus. So, Professor Panayi, good evening. Hi.
Thank you. Hello.
I was wondering if you could start us off by sort of sharing your own kind of family history of migration.
Okay, so I'll start with my father, who actually migrated entirely by himself. So migration historians talk about chains or networks. The only network he had is he knew he had an uncle in Bournemouth, which is on the south coast of England, and he said he left the country without telling his mother when he was 18. He worked for his uncle Alebi. He was a pastry cook in Nicosia, and he came to London and experienced social mobility essentially in a period where migrants in Britain could experience social mobility, which is much more difficult now. And my mother came as part of a network, I guess, a family network. So her uncle had already migrated to London in the 1930s and was a baker in Soho, and he had a fascinating World War II history where he actually fought in Borneo as a Cypriot. And so she arrived in Camden Town in London and joined her brother and sister. And then I was actually born in London in the early 1960s. So that's my personal migration history.
And growing up, do you have any memory of hearing stories, either about the journey to England or stories from back home, things that stayed with you?
There weren't really many stories about the journey, except when I grew up and became a historian and asked my parents about their journey. And of course, for migration historians, that's really important. And the one thing they remember absolutely clearly to the very day, and all migrants seem to remember the day when they migrated. So both my parents and my in-laws and all migrants seem to remember the day when they moved, because it's such a momentous day in their life. And of course, they can recall the journey, what means of transport they talk and so on. I mean, what they did talk about constantly, and this is, you know, maybe how the Cypriot peasant is transported to London or anywhere else is their family background, their upbringing, their religion was absolutely fundamental to them. That was their sense of community. I mean, they talked about their about their parents, and of course we used to go on long holidays to Cyprus, which was really transformative for somebody like me who, I mean, we did grow up in, I mean, we didn't grow up in a rough area of London, but we grew up in, I mean, you know, as you know, London goes on forever. So we grew up in, you know, miles away from, you know, green, you know, from the countryside. So when I first went to Cyprus in the summer of 1967, I remember moving from, you know, this advanced economy into this peasant house, this whitewashed peasant house. And one of my clearest memories was when the backyard door opened, and I was assaulted, I think, by hundreds of turkeys, which was like, I mean, it was just amazing, you know, overwhelming, and just such a different to what I'd grown up with. And, you know, I remember very clearly what was also very exciting was that it wasn't exciting for my grandparents, although they were used to it, was that there was no electricity or running water, which, you know, I mean, we were living in one of the most advanced cities in the world. We moved to that, but it was for a 4-year-old. It was, you know, just so exciting, and it just completely changed my outlook on life, really.
Mm-hmm. I mean, in your book, Migrant City, we'll talk about it more in a little bit, but in sort of the preface to that book, you talk about becoming very conscious sort of early in life of living in a multicultural place. I mean, you write, this early experience of diversity formed the way I think and orientate myself, to the extent that as an adult, I have found countless situations in which a lack of diversity makes me feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, the summer when I went to Cyprus, just before I went to school, I had that experience, and then I had to go to school, which was really traumatic. And well, actually, one of the things that happened was my parents didn't teach me to speak English. So that was, I might as well have been born in Cyprus, because I was brought up in a completely Greek Cypriot environment. And I think, you know, one of the things that formed me is this, you know, these trips back to Cyprus, but the other was, you know, my primary school just determined everything about me. Because I think if you think about post-war migration to Britain, you know, the research tends to focus on people from the West Indies and then from South Asia, and Cypriots tend to be ignored. But one very important thing about Cypriots is that they arrived at exactly the same time as West Indians. So we're very sort of similar chronological communities. I mean, in many ways, we're quite different, but chronologically, well, actually, there's probably more similarities than differences. So in my school as a 5-year-old, I was surrounded by, well, black faces, and that's what was completely normal to me. And then when I entered the white historical profession in Britain, I mean, you know, when I say white, it's white British. I mean, it was a real shock, because I'd never experienced these sorts of situations before. And, you know, now I used to run a department where we have diversity, because people appoint in their image, and I wanted to appoint, you know, people who looked like the people who I grew up with. And so, you know, we have quite a diverse history department, way ahead of the game, you know, more diverse than most other history departments. So, you know, that sort of, you know, it's just completely normal to me, in a way that, you know, universities and British society is obsessed with ramming diversity down people's throats. And for me, it's just, that's my life. You know, from the age of 5, that's what I experienced. And so I don't really need to think about diversity, because that's what normality is to me.
Do you feel like these early memories and experiences, they've influenced kind of the profession that you went into, or maybe the kind of things that you would be working on as a historian, or even the way you do your research?
I think, I mean, I've often wondered if the reason I became a historian was because I felt, you know, different from mainstream British society, and I just wanted to find out where I came from, although, you know, I didn't really research where I came from. And then actually I didn't want to be a historian of migration. I wanted to be a historian of Germany, which I did achieve, and published quite a bit of stuff on German history. Although I did study the German diaspora, in fact, and my PhD thesis was on, you know, which is now a classic, and you know, it's very important for understanding World War I Britain, is the persecution and ethnic cleansing of Germans from the British Empire in the First World War. So in some ways, so Richard Evans once told me, you often study, or when he once told me, you study something that's once removed from you. So I didn't study the Cypriots. I studied, you know, the Germans, who are a minority community in Britain, which no one had studied before, and the story of their experiences in World War I is absolutely horrific, because they were ethnically cleansed, which I always knew because of the amount of research I did. But I once remember giving a lecture in York to the York German Circle, and there was somebody in the audience who'd actually been a Jewish person who'd experienced pogroms in Vienna, and he said, this is exactly what the Nazis did, which sort of, you know, which I'd always known, but I mean, it was very interesting to hear, you know, someone who was a Jewish child actually say that to me. So yeah, probably, yeah, my background does have an impact, but I mean, in a sense, I've done quite a wide range of things, and I guess I really wanted to become a historian from when I moved on to do my PhD. So yeah.
Yeah, in our previous meeting, our conversation in the municipal garden, you sort of mentioned this fork in the road for you as a historian or an aspiring historian, where you had a very interesting conversation with your supervisor, and you chose to not focus on sort of Cypriot history and sort of Cypriot migration. Do you think that was, in retrospect, was it the right way to do it, the right way to go?
Definitely. I think it was my undergraduate tutor. He was called Dr. Roland Quinault. He didn't publish very much, but I mean, he was an incredibly brilliant man. You know, one of the most brilliant, intelligent people I've ever met in my life, and you know, I had great admiration for him. And so I told him I wanted to do something on Germanophobia in Britain before the First World War, and he actually suggested the idea. Nobody's done the German community in World War I, but then he said, well, maybe you should do the Cypriots in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it did cross my mind, and we thought about it. And then, but then he said to me, maybe it's a bit too early, because this was in the early 1980s, and so you know, then I have no regrets about the path I took, really. So yeah, I mean, I think it was the right decision.
And was it in any way related to the way you experienced yourself living in a sort of more multicultural or a global place?
You mean focusing on this ethnic group?
Yeah. Well, going wider than the sort of Cypriot history, or this history of the Cypriot community in London, or the issue of migration of the Cypriot community.
It could be. I mean, I guess the other thing about me is I'm probably, I mean, you know, migration historians talk about assimilation or acculturation. I mean, I don't know what I am. I'm probably very assimilated in many ways, but on the other hand, I do have, you know, I mean, my Greekness or my Greek Cypriotness, which is something I stress very strongly. And you know, Greece is a different country. You know, I don't know if we're going to go on to that at some stage, but I mean, I'm certainly a Greek Cypriot, and you know, that comes through my family. You know, that's what makes me a Greek Cypriot. Both of my parents, and you know, my ethnic heritage, if you like, and my religion is what makes me a Greek Cypriot. On the other hand, I'm very British. I mean, I don't know, you know, when I go to international conferences and speak about the German diaspora, I don't know what accent people expect me to have, whether they expect me to have a Cypriot accent or what. But I mean, you know, I mean, I'm a Londoner. I mean, I think my primary identities are well, actually, my first identity is a Londoner, and I think my wife would also describe herself as a Londoner. And, you know, the reason, I mean, we might come back onto this later, but the reason I wrote that book, Migrant City, is because Londoners are like me. You know, they have funny names like me. You know, they have done for centuries, and they certainly have done since the Second World War, and, you know, especially after the 2004 Brexit. Sorry, not Brexit, the EU enlargement, when we were still before Brexit. So, you know, London is a very I mean, that's what I argued in the book. It's the ultimate multicultural city.
Yes.
And I'm a Londoner, and Londoners are like me.
I mean, that's fascinating, because I mean, I came to your work through Migrant City, actually, and it was fascinating that you call it a new history of London. Why did you decide to call it a new history of London?
All right, well, I'll have to give you the frank answer, because the publisher told me. So actually what happened is that we couldn't decide on what title to use. And it was quite, so I wanted to call it Londoners, which would have worked just as well. But I mean, there's already a book published with that name. In fact, as we discovered, the book was published a year or two before mine, which a few months before mine, with the same title. So we missed that. But I mean, in a sense, yeah, I take your point. I mean, calling a new history just moves away from, you know, the traditional approaches to London history. And I mean, I'm still quite amazed at, you know, London histories which don't focus so heavily on migration, because it's just been, I mean, you know, I didn't deal with domestic migration, which is obviously very important for the growth of London, probably up to the Second World War. But after the Second World War, what happens is you have I don't know, what people call white flight. So white people move to the suburbs, and migrants move into the vacated spaces. And that's why migrants who moved into London immediately after the Second World War could afford housing, which they can't anymore, because London was a city in demographic decline for most of the post-war period, and that only reversed from the 1980s and 1990s onwards. So, you know, one of the reasons for ridiculous house prices in London actually is just a supply and demand issue, whereas in the 1950s and 1960s, when my parents came, and when West Indians came, and when South Asians came, I mean, you know, housing was really cheap. So, you know, that filled that white flight gap, if you like.
I mean, it's fascinating that you focus on things like housing, for example. I feel like this is your perspective in the book as well. You're not focusing on the lives of the elite, the people who kind of make up the upper strata of society. You're focusing on everyday people, everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, you know, from the time I guess if you could sum up my work in one sentence, it's probably the consequences of political decisions upon individual lives. And that's what my PhD was about. It was about how, you know, Germanophobic hatred in World War I destroyed the lives of tens of thousands of people. I guess, I mean, I think with Migrant City, I've moved away from that. And you know, to the point where one has to recognize that migrants aren't victims. They're not just victims, you know, all migrants experience racism, but on the other hand, they're active players in their own lives. And if so, the book's in many ways a social history. And what I mean, you know, it has several distinct features, because London has distinct features. And one of the distinct features of migration to London is that all social groups come to London, all social migrant groups. So, you know, on the one hand, you have Nathan Mayer Rothschild, you have lots of Jewish bankers, you have an elite Greek community in 19th century London. Mm-hmm. So you can't ignore them, because migration, you know, the discourse both from left and right is that immigrants are poor people. So from the left is they're victims and we have to protect them. From the right is, you know, they're dirty foreigners and so on. So the reality is that that's not what migration is much more complex, especially when you examine London. And that all came when I was working on the German community in 19th century London. They weren't just one social group. So you've got these elites, and then, well, you said you lived in London. If you go into a shop in London, you're not going to be served by a white British person. If you go to a small shop, or, you know, I don't think there's many small shops which are owned by white British people anymore. And that has a long history. So if you go back to the 19th century, you have Irish and Jewish, you know, hawkers and so on. And then, of course, you have the working classes, who are, you know, the stereotype of the migrant in all societies. So that was very important. It's also the level of diversity. And then one of the other things about London, which I think is unique compared with anywhere else I've lived, is that anybody can live next to anybody. So, you know, you can have a Hungarian neighbor living next to a black person living next to a Greek Cypriot in 1960. Today, well, you can live next to anybody really, and I think that's so. You have had ghettoization, and you did have what, you know, you might describe as a Jewish ghetto in the East End in the late 19th century. That breaks down. And one of the other stories I want to tell is that social mobility tends to happen for migrants over generations, and that's how you have to look at it. And it's not just some, you know, when social scientists look at migration, you know, they just focus on the negative on the moment. You know, if you look at progression, so if we look at the Greek Cypriot community in London that evolves from the 1960s, I mean, that is very diverse socially, but it also experiences social mobility, especially through housing purchase. And, you know, one of the other things which I didn't do enough of in the book is who owns London, actually. You know, it's not white British people who own London, it's all sorts of ethnic groups going back to the Jewish community of the late 19th century. So it's a very complex place in all sorts of ways from a migration and ethnicity point of view. And you know, these straightforward stereotypes of, you know, migrants are this or migrants are that is just very unhelpful, because it's a really, really complex story.
Mm-hmm. What I found particularly strong is how you go from this global perspective, or the overall kind of perspective on migration in London from all over the world, and then you focus on specific communities at different points, going deep into their history in order to highlight a lot of these things that you just mentioned. And I think it's worth saying here that this new history of London is a history spanning from sort of Roman times to the present day almost. And so how do you straddle this not so fine line, I guess, between this global perspective and the in-depth kind of looking into each community?
Well, I mean, to deal with the first point, the point about the Romans, that's absolutely fundamental, because London didn't exist before the Romans. I mean, I know there's countless cities all over London, over Europe and the Middle East and North Africa, which you could say that, but you know, it's had a constant flow of migrants. Well, I mean, to answer your question, it just goes back to this issue of you can't understand individual lives, you know, unless you understand, you know, global perspectives. You know, I mean, the global perspective. I mean, there's this book doesn't particularly deal with the reasons for migration. I mean, I've done that in other research, but you know, I suppose my publisher encouraged me to look at these individual life stories, which is what I tried to do in the book. And I think I focused on some of the most important communities and also the ones that I knew best. So the Germans are there all the time. The Jews, especially those that arrived from Russia at the end of the 19th century, are there. I know a lot about the Irish, the Irish built London. I mean, not single-handedly, but they built London in the 19th century, and they built it in the early post-war period. West Indians are also very important. South Asians. I mean, a group that's really overlooked are Poles. Poles don't just suddenly appear in 2004. They're there at the end of the Second World War. And one of my former colleagues, Kathy Burrell, who's now at Liverpool, you know, did research indicating actually that the Poles who came after 2004 often have networks with the Poles who came in the second half of the, you know, during the war and after the Second World War. And, you know, that, you know, if you walk through London, or, you know, there's certain parts of London which are very Polish, you know, West London, parts of West London, Hammersmith, Ealing. I mean, you know, they're very Polish areas going back to the Second World War. And I did a book fair a couple of weeks ago where you know, well, the phrase I always use is that London is a very Jewish city. It's a very Irish city. It's a very, well, it's actually a very African city as well. I mean, I didn't do very much about Africans because there's not very much research on Africans, but Africans far outnumber West Indians today. It's a very Cypriot city as well. I mean, probably mostly in North London, it's a very Polish city and so on. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Mm-hmm. Where, since we've started also talking about the different communities and also the Cypriots more specifically, where do the Cypriots fit into this puzzle, the big picture, where communities come into London at different times and establish themselves in different ways?
Well, I mean, the Cypriot, I haven't come across any Cypriots in the 19th century. So the takeoff is really in the 1920s and more especially in the 1930s. And so you have this small community which develops especially in Soho, and they're especially working in catering. Catering is a classic occupation for migrants. And I think you told me the other day that that's one of the avenues open for non-European migrants in Cyprus today. And you know, that's, you know, I think the reason for that is because it's really hard work, and therefore natives don't like doing that. And if you look at the fish and chip trade in Britain, which Cypriots were very important in, you know, when you talk to Cypriots who ran fish and chip shop, it's just the number of hours they had to put into this is phenomenal. And, you know, the Cypriots are preceded in the fish and chip trade by Italians. And, you know, there's somebody's actually written 3 books, Joe Pieri, 3 books about running fish and chip shops in Glasgow. And, you know, one of the themes is hard work, you know, and how many hours he had to work. And of course, it meant social mobility. And of course, the community remains relatively small until after the Second World War. Although, you know, I told the story of my great uncle who I didn't know, who anglicized his name to Charlie, and fought in Borneo. And I assume there were many Charlies who, one of my school friends, his father who was quite, I mean, he must have been born in the 1920s or even before that. He fought in Egypt as well. I mean, I think from England rather than directly from Cyprus. So the community remains relatively small until the second half of the 1950s. And, you know, there's a lot of family migration, you know, that takes place from Cyprus, both Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. I mean, I guess the divide between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots is similar to what it was on the island in terms of the demographics of it. I mean, one group which is completely ignored by historians is Turkish Cypriots in London, and there's hardly anything being published about them, like a handful of articles. But I mean, I think their experience is probably similar to the Greek Cypriots in the sense that they, as a whole, experience social mobility, open up small businesses. And I think within London, they just, I mean, I think they're much closer to each other than they are towards white British society. And you know, from my father's experience, I mean, he worked with many Turkish Cypriots, and it was like back home, I think. So, I mean, I guess when you take it over the long run, then the Cypriot community is probably going to disappear. And the community I'd probably compare it with is the Huguenots, who arrived, you know, French refugees, religious refugees who arrived in the 17th century initially. And so you have all these Huguenot churches all over London, but there's no Huguenots left. And I think the reason why the Cypriots are going to disappear are because they don't marry each other. Well, I don't know if they get married at all, but they often marry the people from I mean, you know, we're down to probably the fourth or fifth generation. So there's no way that, you know, it's increasingly unlikely you're going to marry the same ethnic group. And so the Cypriots in 100 years' time are going to be like the Huguenots. There's going to be traces. Well, there'll probably still be, well, there may be one or two Greek Orthodox churches left, maybe the big one in Camden Town, and the one in Bayswater, that goes back, the Greek Orthodox Church in Bayswater, that was actually established by Greek merchants in the 19th century, and actually I think that still is predominantly Greek rather than Greek Cypriot. That's not a church I've ever been to, though I probably should. So I think that's how the Cypriot community, I mean, it was a working class group, it was a peasant group. I mean, there are middle class Cypriots who certainly come, or educated Cypriots who come from you know, wealthier families in the cities, but I mean, you know, the typical migrant from Cyprus is you know, someone who works on the land, really. I mean, my father had actually worked in Nicosia before he came, so that probably made it easier for him to move to Britain, because he'd left home when he was 12 to become apprenticed to his uncle. I mean, my mother moved straight from her village to London, which, well, I mean, that must have been an extraordinary experience, you know, moving from a village of 1,000 people, Limgia, to I don't know if London was probably still certainly one of the biggest cities in the world, as it still is, in the early 1960s.
I mean, I'd like to talk more about that. I'll come back to it in just a second, but I also wanted to highlight this comment you made earlier about sort of the restaurant trade or the catering services, so on. I think it comes out, or I get from your work, that it is particularly important for the Cypriot community, but it also highlights not just the social mobility that it allows a group like the Cypriots to acquire social mobility, but also that it is based on creating links with other communities. So buying the businesses, continuing this work that another community builds, and also perhaps the two-way kind of it's like an exchange of a culture. So in your book Fish and Chips, which we haven't really talked about, but you sort of show that this British thing, par excellence, British, it's a symbol of Britishness, is actually prepared and brought to the British from all kinds of immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, the dish itself is almost certainly Jewish in origin because of the fried fish. I mean, the chips are probably French in origin or Belgian in origin. And then at some time in the second half of the 19th century, they marry each other, I guess is the word, and gradually become a British staple. So by the First World War, in fact, somebody's written that Britain won the First World War because of fish and chips, because it was a readily available cheap food. And so today, fish and chips is regarded as unhealthy. Well, straight after this lecture, I'm going to have my fish and chips. So because you have to practice what you preach, I think. But anyway, if you're a coal miner or involved in manual work, then fish and chips is an incredibly cheap and nutritious meal. But to get back to your question, I think there's Jewish. So some of the early research I did about the origins of fish and chips. Sometimes there's reports in some of the newspapers about fires that took place in the East End of London. And it turns out the fire was caused by a Jewish fish fryer who's where something went wrong. So I mean that obviously proves the Jewish origins of it. And then there's Jewish owners in the interwar years, especially in London. And then after the Second World War, I mean, again, if you go into a fish and chip shop in London, you're not going to be served by a white British person. I mean, there's a chance you will be. I mean, it's extremely unlikely. And specifically, Greek Cypriots. I remember I became very conscious of this in about 1989 when I went to Liverpool and I bought some fish and chips and I was served by a Greek Cypriot. And then when I moved to Leicester, I realized that virtually every fish and chip shop in Leicester or Leicestershire was owned by Greek Cypriots. And actually, that was true maybe 20 years ago. Cypriots who tended to move out of London tended to own fish and chip shops. So it was a sort of, migration historians would call it ethnic clustering. You do what your fellow countryman does. And I guess, again, it goes back to the hard work aspect of it. I mean, I'm not sure these fish and chip shops tend to pass through generations. But, it might be, I mean, there's some that do in London. But often they're just taken over by the next ethnic group, essentially.
And sort of going back to this point about the majority of Cypriots leaving kind of rural Cyprus to get to this huge multicultural place, and this is something I've always kind of asked myself, walking through Soho, for example, what it must have been like for someone, the experience of leaving, let's say, Limgia, and finding themselves in Soho, working with and for Italians or for a Jewish kind of shop.
Yeah, I mean, that, when my mother moved to London, her first employers were Jews, which again is a normal story. I think she was probably very excited, and of course the reason why Cypriots come to London is because of the imperial connection, which is why the migration starts in the 1930s. So there may be personal motivations, but obviously you need to look at the political background to all this. And my mother came in 1960, just as the legislation was changing. So the 1948 British Nationality and Status of Aliens Act basically allows everyone in the British Empire to live in Britain. That wasn't actually its aim, but from the going back to the 19th century, the imperial masters in London wanted a centralized system of British citizenship, but that's what the consequence of it was. And then, then you just have the normal discourse, there's too many immigrants. And so you get the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which after that makes Cypriot migration and Commonwealth imperial migration much more difficult. But you do have family reunification. And Cypriots can move in other ways, and of course some come in 1974 as well.
In general, how were Cypriots received by the British government? In general, were they welcome to migrate, or it was made very difficult for them?
I think before the Second World War, it was problematic, and there were you needed permits. In the 1930s. I mean, by the 1950s, there isn't much difficulty. And I guess one of the issues about Cypriots is that they tend to be ignored in their history of post-war migration to Britain, and the group that's really comes to the fore are people of West Indian origin. So I've got a colleague who works on Africans in Britain, and I think him and I keep having this discussion about, a lot of migration history in post-war Britain is dominated by the experience of West Indians and to a lesser extent, and also South Asians. But what about Africans? Africans, as I said before, I mean, there's more than 1 million Africans in Britain, but I mean, they don't have a history really written about. I mean, my colleague Chris Zembi is trying to address this. But some Cypriots tend to be ignored both by public opinion and by the government. But in a sense, I think there's probably a lot of hostility because of the Oga killings of British soldiers. And I haven't dug very deeply into that, but I suspect if I did, I'd probably find that there is hostility. So there are examples. So in the article that I wrote with Andrikos Varnava, I give this example of somebody who was standing at the bus stop and who was really violently beaten by two white British people in Camden Town, if I remember correctly. And I wonder how widespread that was. I mean, my relatives have never told me they ever experienced anything like that. But I mean, actually, just from a personal, I can give you stories of myself. I remember once I was doing a university open day, and one of the women who came with her son or daughter to speak to me just sort of confronted me and said, my brother was in Cyprus in the 1950s. As a soldier. Well, I don't know, what do you expect me to do about it, and it's very interesting. That's the memory of Cyprus, and that's not the only time that's happened with people who've got no, I mean, it probably wouldn't happen in London or North London because white British people have experience of Cypriots, but in Leicester where they don't, that's happened. And one of the librarians said that to me as well. That was her, that one of her relatives was in Cyprus in the 1950s. On the other hand, I once taught a mature student who was much more philosophical about it and told me about a story. He was in doing national service and told me a story about when he was in a Jeep and some Elga person threw a grenade into the back of his Jeep, but they managed to throw it out before it exploded. So, so I think there was this probably hostility in the 1950s, especially because of the Elga killings. But I guess, Cypriots ultimately haven't had the sort of experiences that, Black and Asian groups have experienced in terms of racism. But I mean, when I was at school, I definitely knew I was a foreigner. There was absolutely no doubt about that. And also when I moved, into the historical profession, which was bourgeois, white British, basically, and I knew I was a foreigner. I mean, the first job I got was at Keele University, which is all white males. I mean, I felt really foreign there, and I lived in Stoke-on-Trent, which is a very white place, and it's Brexit central, actually. It's an incredibly undiverse place. So, I think, Cypriots tend to be ignored. They have experienced some racism, but I mean, in a sense, that's not what they focus on. They focus on family and work, and which leads to social mobility, I think.
And so the Cypriot peasant at home and abroad, how do you get from thinking about sort of the world that Cypriots find themselves in London to thinking about the world they kind of leave behind? How do you make that jump?
So I think, in various ways. So I told you the story about, Roland Quinault, who, I ignored that for very many years. But then I think in 1987, I made two really important journeys. One was my first research trip to Germany, where, which I mean, I've been back to this place. It's on the Rhine, and I have a very close attachment to Cyprus. I actually have a much closer attachment to Germany, and my wife's been to Cyprus and to Germany with me, and she goes, when I had my 60th birthday this year, we went back to the Rhine. Because she says, whenever I go back to Germany, I just have a real happiness about me, which I don't have anywhere else. So that was my research trip, and about so I have that really close attachment with Germany. But about 4 or 5 weeks after that, I went to stay with my grandparents, without my parents in the way, if you like, because I guess a lot of your experience with your grandparents often, well, it was for me, was through your parents. So I was, it was with, and I mean, I want to use the word peasant. And there is a Journal of Peasants Studies which still exists. So they were absolutely Greek Cypriot peasants, and that was, in many ways, in some ways, the two, really important for my life. And actually, I just spoke to them about their lives, which were just, and in many ways, they're the most interesting people I've ever met in my life, because their lives were just so different from my life in London. Essentially, and I just asked them all these questions about their lives, and I was just amazed. They lived long years. They lived until their mid-80s in both cases, and they hadn't had any mod cons. They had no fridge, they had no radio, they had no TV, they had no phone. Well, okay, they had the amount of furniture, so they had the furniture which they had when they got married. Their bed and their cupboard, and I mean, I was just fascinated how these people with these really who led this basic life, had led this really healthy life as well. So at that stage, I wanted to. I think I decided I wanted to write a book about the Cypriot peasant. But that was in 1987, and so I've only come back to it, how long ago is that? 35 years later. But the way it happened is, I read a lot of the work of Andrikos Varnava, because I was, well, he knows this, so this is no secret. So I was refereeing a lot of his work, and that got me back into developing an interest in Cyprus. And then one day I spoke to my mother, and she about her family history and her family photographs. So she gave me some family photographs, some of which I'd never seen before. And then when we talked about her family history, we couldn't go back back to the Ottoman period. So we don't know who her, so she knows who her grandparents are. She doesn't know who her great grandparents are. And so somehow that stimulated my interest. And so this initial interest I had in 35 years ago was reborn. So I guess that's how this happened. And increasingly, I get increasingly irritated by the fact that migration historians do focus on specific groups and ignore others. And Cypriots, in a sense, are a small group, and maybe they should be ignored. But then groups like Africans in London, why are they ignored? But I mean, from my point of view, I don't. Is that what happens to people when they get older? Then they go back to their roots. I don't know. Although
yes,
my roots are quite complicated.
So do you feel like this is a better time for you to do this research than 35, 40 odd years ago?
Is this a what time? Sorry, I missed the question.
Is this a better time to do the research now?
Yeah, I guess the other thing is that I don't feel I need to prove myself to anybody because of all the publications in the various fields that I've done. So I think now I can do what I would like to do. And in a sense, as a researcher, you have to do what motivates you. And this is what motivates you. I mean, publishers or often approach you asking you to do stuff, but then you need to do the stuff that you want to do. I mean, I remember when we met in the park the other day, you said to me, why don't you write for a commercial publisher? Well, I mean, those sorts of books are really hard to do, but if you commit yourself to a project which you don't enjoy, which I have done when I have tried to do these really big topics, then you don't enjoy. And to go back to some of the stuff we've been discussing before, I mean, I'm interested in, I'm not a novelist, but I mean, I'm interested in people's individual lives, from those poor Germans who I studied for my PhD, who had these horrendous experiences, who had their houses smashed, who were persecuted, who lived in the country forever. So in a sense, what I've been doing, so one of the things so it's called the Cypriot Peasant. And so therefore to use the imperial, the post-colonial discourse, the subaltern has to speak. So I was quite worried about this because what I'm doing is I'm using a lot of British imperial sources, both in Kew in the National Archives, and then I've spent about 20 days in the State Archives in Ngomi, where they now are, and that's the official perspective. And then I didn't realize that the Cyprus Research Centre had about 10,000 interviews with people who were born as long ago as the late 19th century. And I'm not, I've spoken about some turning points in my life. I mean, I remember when some of the first interviews I was listening to, and they were actually from the Cyprus Folklore Archive. And, these were people who were born before the First World War. And they were, especially, I listened to some from Farmaga, and I've picked Farmaga as one of my case study villages, because that's where one of my great grandfathers was a priest from Farmaga. And he was like, I think the word I want to use is mind blowing, because, these people were just, telling these long tales, singing these songs, going back to, I don't know what their origins are, describing their lives. It was like, I remember the first time I viewed a newspaper when I did my undergraduate dissertation. It was like almost a spiritual experience, because I was in touch. I mean, you know, you're a historian. You know, it's when you're in touch with the primary source. When I first came across my first newspaper, I mean, in those days, it wasn't online. You got the real newspaper. You got these big stands. You put it on the stand, and at the end of the day, it all fell to pieces. I mean, I was listening to these people who were born, you know, as long ago as the 1880s maybe, and it was really. So I've listened to about 100 from a series. Well, I've picked on 4 villages: Farmaga, because of that connection with me; Limya, because it's where my mum came from; Midseron, because that's where my father came from; and then the other one was Rizal Garbaso, because that's where my uncle was from. And Rizal Garbaso, of course, is a absolutely fascinating place, not just in Cyprus, probably anywhere. But you know, I've listened to so many interviews about Rizal Garbaso, probably dozens, and well, certainly dozens, and Apostolos Andreas as well, which is a fascinating place. Yeah.
And I mean, it's fascinating that you talk about kind of the subaltern speaking. You're also introducing an oral history element, but also an autobiographical element to this project. You will be kind of speaking to your parents, and maybe even bringing in your own memories of things. So what made you kind of decide on introducing this autobiographical kind of element?
Well, I think a lot of historians do this. So one of the historians I know, Mark Matsauer, who works on Greece and the Balkans. I mean, he's from essentially an elite Russian Jewish background, and he wrote a story about his one of his ancestors. I mean, his social background is completely different from mine. So it's not. I mean, I'm not sure how autobiographical it's going to be. I mean, in a sense, you know, when you're faced with 10,000 interviews from every village in Cyprus, I mean, you need to make a decision. You can't go through 10,000 interviews. You know, I've managed 100, which I think, you know, from an oral history methodology point of view, it's more than enough. And so I mean, I guess I could have done it another way. I could have done one in, you know, regions. I could have done one from Băhçes, one from, you know, the other regions of Cyprus. But actually, in many ways, I think I've got all bases covered. I've got a seaside town. I've got 2 internal towns, and I've also got a mountain village in the case of Farmaga. So, you know, the different, you know, one of my themes is work. So, you know, the different work patterns, you know, if you're doing what's the word, vines in Farmaga is different from, you know, and one of the other themes is food. And, you know, I mean, you know, as a food historian, I'm absolutely fascinated by the variety of food available in Rizal Garbaso. And, you know, it's the fish that's available. They're often, the interviewers often ask them whether they ate turtles, which some of them did. I mean, I just describe the process of cooking a turtle, and the interviewers always ask them about shellfish. So not, sorry, garaudos, snails. So snails, and you know, people from Rizal Garbaso just say so many different types of snails. And, you know, they must have, and I this always reminds me of my uncle, who, when we used to go to the seaside with my cousins and my parents and my uncle, he used to do this thing which we found absolutely disgusting, where he used to, I'm not sure I know what the limpet is the English word, bedalines, where he used to take it from a rock, get his penknife out and stick it straight into his mouth. Which of course we just found it very shocking, but you know, it's probably what he grew up with in this. You know, when you hear these descriptions and these interviews, you know, it almost sounds like a lost paradise. I mean, I didn't, I mean, I'm finishing in 1960 rather than going, up to 1974. But obviously that these people who've had to leave do very much feel like it's a lost paradise lost, I guess, when you listen to these interviews.
So one last question from me before we go to questions from the audience. We talked about you maintaining kind of a more imperial history perspective in this book, even though this will focus on the lives in Cyprus. Why did you decide to maintain this perspective, and do you think this kind of a study can contribute to our understanding of Britain and the empire, even perhaps other places in the world?
Well, I mean, the title I'm going with now is The Cypriot Peasant, and it's every subtitle, Everyday Life and Modernisation under British rule. So, I mean, I guess when you look at the British imperial documents, what the British clearly did was modernise Cyprus, in all sorts of ways. And I mean, I think I said to you the other day, I mean, they're obsessed with goats because they think goats are really destructive, and they introduce all sorts of goats laws. They're obsessed with water, and they transform, as far as I can understand from reading the British imperial documents, they transform the water supply of Cyprus. They're obsessed with locusts, and locusts. Well, I mean, I think there's still occasional locust storms in Cyprus, even in the 21st century. But I mean, they really focus on that, and so they do modernise the country in all sorts of ways, politically as well, I guess, but socially, economically. And Cyprus is so one of the things, I guess, where you can measure the success of British rule is through demography, because there's a population explosion from the end of the 19th century, and that's because of the social reforms, the economic reforms, the infrastructure reforms, I guess, is what we're talking about, which the British introduce. So at some stage there's going to be a discussion about it's partly about the consequences of British rule, and they're both positive and negative, but I mean, in a sense, from the everyday life's point of view, I mean, they seem to be overwhelmingly positive. I mean, for the British Empire, Cyprus is just I think under Kosovo and others use this phrase, an inconsequential possession. I mean, it's a possession, actually. And so what the British imperial documents highlight is, there may have been an element of altruism towards the Cypriot peasant, but there's also an element of economic utility. I mean, that's something I know it was taken over from a strategic point of view, but there's so much stuff in the National Archives in London about, what's the worth of peaches or oranges or whatever, or olives. And that was the primary purpose. I mean, just one other thing I think I want to say. I mean, one of the other reasons I did this book is because the Cypriot peasant is ignored in Cypriot historiography. I mean, except in the Cyprus Research Centre, which has published these absolutely magnificent book with, their labours of love, really. The other day, when I was in Cyprus last week, on my last day, I came across a 2-volume book about, the Cypriot wedding, about 900 pages long. I mean, forgotten her name, Galiobi Brodababa, isn't it? And I mean, this is just such extraordinary quality. And I really want to, and of course the overall, and Cyprus historiography is, why did 1974 happen and why did 1960 happen? Cyprus history is much richer than that. And what these people do is, who write these histories, is they ignore the Cypriot people. And the one thing I want to do, and that's why I've called it this, is to talk about the Cypriot people you know, their everyday experiences, their lives, their culture, their religion, you know, the whole lot. And, you know, I mean, I hope my research will make an impact, and hopefully I can get a, you know, significant British publisher to issue it. So, and, you know, I mean, yesterday when I was in the British Library, I was again reading this wonderfully detailed book, Georgiades, about the British administration under Sir Ronald Stores. It's a magnificent book, but there's no peasants in it. There's no Cypriots in it. It's just about, this is what, you know, this colonial secretary wrote to that colonial secretary. And, you know, we have to move away from all this nonsense and focus upon the Cypriot population. Sorry, I'm preaching, but, you know, it's very important that, you know, it's just made, you know, that, you know, to go back to your earlier question, I guess that's really what's motivating me above all, that the Cypriot people have been ignored in Cypriot historiography. So that's a nice way to end.
Thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation. I have so many more questions, but I think it's time to allow the audience also to have their say. Evrensel, would you like to take over?
Yes. Thank you, Professor Panayi and Loizos, for that interesting conversation, a very exciting conversation. Yeah, we're now moving to the Q&A section. If you have a question, please either use the raise hand function on Zoom, or you can also type your question in the chat section as well.
When it's written, so I've just completed the research. So hopefully I'll write in the next next 18 months, something like that, and then I'll have to find a publisher. So it probably won't be available for up to 3 years, I'm afraid. But anyway, you can read my article on the bewildered peasant in London, which isn't really about the Cypriot peasant, but it's about transplanting of one particular family from Loizos Kapsalis actually to London.
I mean, we didn't get any a chance to talk about that, but I think maybe if you sort of lay down the kind of the basic premise of that article, it would be great.
Yeah, I mean, what it was, it was, I think it was a story of, you know, I was partly motivated by the ignoring of Cypriots in immigration historiography in Britain. And actually it really came to fruition through a conversation. Well, I did it with Andrei Kosovo, so it was through a conversation with him in the National Archives, actually, when we were working on two completely different subjects. And that's how we focused on it. And actually we both knew people who knew the murderess, who knew Stilo Christofi, actually. And that's how we moved on to it. But then when we started writing it, you know, we focused on, we focused on the press reporting, family life in London. I mean, family is absolutely central for Greek Cypriots. So you can't understand Cypriot either in Cyprus or in the diaspora without focusing on the family. And you know, it was also very interesting that the daughter-in-law who was murdered, Helga, was a German. So the son had married, had entered into a interethnic relationship quite early, when that was very unusual amongst the Cypriot community in London, and it brought in things like honor, which is something I want to explore in the book. And somehow, you know, you had the feeling that Stilo Christofi thought that there was dishonor going on because she suspected that the daughter-in-law was having extramarital affairs, and so there was you know, in a sense she was carrying out an honor killing, to understand it through 21st century perspective. So I think there's some more questions.
Yeah, there's a comment from Marina who says, thank you so much. I'm doing a PhD on Cypriot lace, but specifically the women who make it, because as you say, their lives have been ignored and are generally undocumented. And asking, please, can I email you to discuss this further?
Of course, yeah. Should I put my email in there?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. And yeah, we also have a question and reflection from Maria, who I think is not with us at the moment because her battery died, but Loizos is going to play it. I think it's a recorded. Yeah.
You can't get rid of me. Let me see if this works.
So much shared with us resonates with me as well, because like Loizos, I've lived in London for more or less 15 years. A reflection and a question, if I may. I would like to say a big thank you, because while I was listening to you, when you just when you first started unfolding your journey of your family journey and also your academic journey, you mentioned how Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, were not mentioned in relation to the migration in Great Britain. And for quite some time, I felt like this uneasiness and agitation, because I couldn't find myself. Like I couldn't, in terms of representation, I guess the word I'm going for here is representation. I couldn't find, or I couldn't see myself in London, and I knew there were so many people like me there. I believe the first time I came across Greek Cypriots being mentioned was in the book Lovers and Strangers, if I'm not mistaken, from Claire Wills.
She completely.
It's the first time I've seen Cypriots mentioned, discussed in the history of migration to Great Britain, and I was so ecstatic, enthusiastic. I was circling every reference and every page that made reference to Cypriots. And now coming across your work, I finally saw myself like being present and acknowledged in London. So big thank you for that. My question originally was on whether the Turkish Cypriot experience resembles the Greek Cypriot experience. I think you said you haven't looked you haven't looked deeply into that, but you would say that it is more or less like a very similar experience. So I would like to go for a different question. What about the female Greek Cypriot experience in London? One of the things that puzzled me and like was really intriguing for me was when I was working in Greek community schools, and therefore like meeting many families and first, second, third, fourth generation Greek Cypriots. And I could see these grandmothers, these first generation women that didn't speak English because they stayed at home to raise the children and support their husbands at the fish and chips. So to what degree would you say that the female and male Greek Cypriot experience differs? Again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you say that was a recorded message?
Yes, that was a recorded message.
So actually, I'll come back to the Claire Wills book, which was mentioned, because I reviewed that book for the Times Higher, and one of the things that really irritated me about it was actually that it didn't mention Greek Cypriots, and actually there's about, it made me quite mad, but anyway, there was about 3 or 4 references to Greek Cypriots, but anyway, so, my book is completely different. My mother's one of these people who doesn't really speak English, and I think you're right. Definitely I mean, there are women who, not all Greek Cypriot women fit into that stereotype of the woman who works at home and doesn't learn English, and Turkish Cypriot women probably go through the same experience. But in a sense, yeah, the woman working at home in order to bring up the kids. So somehow they're both working round the clock in physical work and also doing all the maternal work as well. And the male is, the male, well, I was going to say male breadwinner, they're both breadwinners, because I think that's how the Cypriot family economy works in London. And it probably goes back to the Cypriot experience in Cyprus, that, every member of the family is involved in manual labor. So that just continues. But yeah, I mean, I agree that the experiences are quite different, because as in Cyprus, the mother is overwhelmingly responsible for the upbringing of the children. So yeah, I mean, I certainly, there is a difference between the two.
Thank you. There's a question from Kellen. Your research sounds so interesting. I look forward to reading your book when it comes out. I'm an anthropology student at the beginning of dissertation research. The archives of interviews you mentioned seem like incredible resources. This is a very practical question, but would you mind saying a little more about these archives? Where are they? Are the interviews digitalized? What language or languages the interviews are in? And he says thanks as well.
So the interviews are in the Cyprus Research Centre, which is in Gladstone 6, which is very close to the Solomon bus station, about 7 minutes away. So you can, again, you can contact me, or you can find them find their address on their website. But I mean, their website's not very well developed, which is probably why people don't know very much about it. So you can email me. Sorry, I can't. Maybe if Loizos puts my email in the university one, dmu.ac.uk, then I can reply to you. But so yeah, they are incredible resources. There's about 10,000 interviews. So there's something called the Cyprus Folklore Archive. Sorry, I'm doing the translation. And the Cyprus Oral Tradition Archive. I think there's about 8,000 interviews in the Cyprus Oral Tradition Archive, and about 2,000. So the Cyprus Oral Tradition Archive is newer, and I think that's probably from the 1990s onwards, and it's much more professional, because these people are trained oral historians, and the resources are brilliant, and the way it's divided is according to village. And so somewhere like Rizogabas and some of the other big villages have, maybe hundreds of interviews. My own parents' villages had only a handful of interviews. They're all in Greek. Well, they're all in Cypriot Greek, obviously. And, the catalogue is in Greek. They're digitized. And, you need to contact the archivist. And Argyros Xenophontos, who's contact me and I can send you more details. And she's really she'll be really helpful. They are digitized, but they're not online. But you can listen to them there, and I think you can download them. As well, but sorry, and so the Oral Tradition Archive is from the 1990s onwards, and those are quite professional. When you listen to the reason I find these, I use the word mind-blowing. Some of these interviews are from 1969, and so the ones I remember in File My God, somebody just turns up with a massive, well, I don't know if you've ever seen these. I remember these from my childhood. One of these massive tape machines with these big. You don't see it because it's an interview, but obviously that's what's going with these big reels, and just bombards these people with questions of all sorts. And one of the things that I found absolutely amazing about these earlier interviews from the folklore archive. So the oral tradition archive is more about everyday life and experiences. Folklore is about, folklore. So, the stories of the stories and the songs, some of the everyday life of the Cypriot peasant. But one of the things that I found, again, really amazing was one of the interviewers who was the lead interviewers, and I can't remember his name. He used to introduce people according to their education. So one of the things he used to do was, Mrs. Sodiru or something, Agramadi, and so uneducated, and somehow being uneducated in this particular instance, gave you added value. I mean, there's not many situations in life where being uneducated gives you added value, but somehow, being uneducated and illiterate, I mean, Agramadi is illiterate rather than uneducated. Yeah, illiterate, sorry, that was the long translation. Illiterate gave you more value as an interviewee, because I mean, I don't know, presumably somehow you're more in touch with these historical traditions than if you've been through the school system, where I guess you've been corrupted by the international school system. And they tell these extraordinarily long tales which last forever. And if you want to understand the Cypriot peasant, then storytelling is so fundamental to the Cypriot peasant, and that's certainly going to come through in my narrative. So I hope I've answered all your questions there. But anyway, just email me and I'll answer you.
Just a quick side note, I'm very happy to read all the questions, but also feel free to ask your questions if you want to, and you can let me know within your comment if you want to ask your own question. Another question comes from Nessim, who asks, when will you, oh, sorry, I already read this question. 1 second. Yeah, another question from Nessim. Will you talk about the Maronite, Romani, or Afro-Cypriots in your book?
Maronites, I don't have much information. Romanis, again, I don't have much information. And Afro-Cypriots, I don't have much information. I mean, I've written an article about the minorities of Cyprus in which I touch upon these groups. So they will come through, but I mean, they don't come through. I mean, the interviews in the Cyprus Research Centre are with Greek Cypriots, again, which is an issue which needs to be resolved, because at the moment it's called the Cypriot peasant, and I'm not sure if I'm going to have to call it the Greek Cypriot peasant, because obviously I can't go into the culture of the Turkish Cypriot peasant because I can't speak Turkish. But on the other hand, the official record does, I mean, there's not very many official documents about any of these groups. I mean, the British authorities tended to ignore them. I came across one file last week about the Maronites and the 1931 rebellion, and the Maronites were absolutely against Enosis in 1931. But I don't have interviews with them, so they're probably not going to be a key feature of the research, essentially, because they can't speak to me in the way that the Greek Cypriots have, and I'm not sure how I would make them speak to me, not in the period that I'm looking at, ending in 1960.
Hannah is asking, I was wondering what you have found in your research regarding Cypriot diasporas, connection, disconnection from the land, and that element of the peasant-ruler transplant. My grandma grew and lovingly tended to a huge fig tree in her garden in London, and I've always thought of what that meant for her.
It meant everything. I'll make this personal as well. So my father, all my relatives, actually my parents have a fig tree now. I mean, they didn't have one when we were younger, but I mean, they just, they had a big garden, because in those days immigrants could afford big gardens in London, and they grew everything in their back garden. So in the summer, we just ate stuff from our back garden. So did my cousins down the road. So yeah, I mean, I don't know what you do for a living. Maybe you should do a research project on this, or a PhD. That would be a great PhD. And actually, I've got a colleague here who works on Caribbean migration, Lisa Palmer, and she's actually done this with regard to West Indians who came to London, sorry, Birmingham in this case, and works their own allotment. So yeah, it's everything. And from a personal point of view, I mean, I have a big garden and I grow everything in the summer, and that's all I eat in the summer. And obviously I have this connection with my peasant background. So yeah, it's really important.
Noor is wondering if you could explain more the social and daily lives of Cypriot peasants in Cyprus, and how did they decide to migrate from Cyprus?
I mean, I think going back to the 1930s, then that's more complicated because the records wouldn't necessarily tell us the individual decisions. When you move to the 1950s, then it's especially about chain migration, family migration. So, you know, it often works on the basis of villages. So to give, I mean, my father, as I've said before, came by himself, and there's, I mean, his village is really small, so he was a pioneer migrant, whereas my mother's villages, and there's, so in London, there's all these village associations from Cyprus, because some villages sent people to a much greater degree than others. So Loizos Kapsalis is another one. So chain migration is really important, or network migration, as it's called. I mean, whether it's to do with, you know, migration as a decision is very complex, and it's not necessarily anything to do with the social or daily lives of peasants in Cyprus. And actually, I don't just deal with international migration, I deal with internal migration. So one of the things that really fascinates me is that, and now I've got a lot of information on this, is a lot of people in the interwar years and into the post-war years, when a lot of boys, especially when they're 12 years old, they leave their village and then go to Lefkosia, or especially Lefkosia and the other towns, actually basically looking for work. And there's loads of oral history about this and that. I mean, in my father's case, it worked because his uncle was a pastry cook, and you know, so it's not just the international migration; it's also the internal migration. So I mean, I'm not sure I've got time to explain more detail the social daily lives of the Cypriot peasants in Cyprus, but I mean, my themes are going. I mean, I'm going to look at work a lot. You know, work patterns. You know, Cypriot peasants grew everything. Well, it depends what area you look at. Looked after all sorts of animals, and so on. So I think you probably have to wait for my book for the detailed description of the everyday lives of the Cypriot peasant.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Panayi. This is the end of our episode. If this episode resonated with you and you would be interested to share your thoughts and feelings with us in our blog, please get in touch with us, and you can write a reflection piece or a review on this blog. And our next webinar will be on 1 minute, sorry, will be on the 14th of December, and we'll be hosting Serkan Karas, and we'll focus on technopolitics and the history of colonial infrastructure in Cyprus under British rule, bringing together the material dimension, such as harbour and railway projects, and the socio-political dimension, such as the British imperial politics or British Cypriot encounters. So it would be great to see all of you there as well. And again, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you once again, Professor Panayi, for this. And yeah, take care, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me. It was very enlightening experience. Thank you.